Hello, psychology students. Welcome to another edition of our Flip videos. Again, I'm Miss Trincherry if I am not your teacher. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about Module 13, which focuses on the two different brain hemispheres that we have and the biology of consciousness as well. So the first thing to understand is that we have one brain as humans. I know it sounds kind of silly to bring up, but it's important to understand. We just have one brain, but there are two different halves of the brain, and those halves are each called hemispheres. So between the two hemispheres, in order for information to get sent from the left hemisphere to the right, and whatever information is on the right hemisphere to get sent to the left, it passes through this bundle of fibers that is called the corpus callosum. So you have each hemisphere and then kind of this like big thick band between the two of them called the corpus callosum that sends information from one hemisphere to the other. So something that researchers have studied is patients who are called split brain patients, which means that for some reason or another, the corpus callosum is severed. So they are not actively able to send information from the left hemisphere to the right or information from the right to the left. And this could either be something that just happened naturally, that for some reason their corpus callosum got damaged, or it could be something that happened intentionally, but with good intent behind it. So sometimes people who have seizures, one way that they have found to prevent them from continuing to happen is by severing that corpus callosum. That way, like basically the theory is there's too much information getting passed back and forth between the two hemispheres. That's what kind of happens with a seizure. So with a split brain patient, they would sever that corpus callosum so that it kind of calms down that information. But instead, that means each hemisphere does its own processing and the two can't talk to each other. So what we kind of want to figure out here is how exactly you study someone with a split brain. It tells us a lot of different information about exactly how the brain works. And so this information here is super fascinating, but it can get a bit confusing. So definitely try your best to stick with me as I'm explaining these different pieces here. So in all people, anyone who has an intact corpus callosum, so both hemispheres communicate with each other, whenever there is something that is in your left visual field, meaning it's something that is primarily seen right in front of your left eye, that is processed by your right hemisphere. Anything that is in your right visual field is processed in your left hemisphere. So technically the visual image that you see in front of you, a little bit of it goes to each eye, but once it's actually processed, it goes to the opposite hemisphere. So something you primarily see from your left eye will go to the right hemisphere. Something you see in your right eye will go to the left hemisphere. So that's important to understand as we move forward with these examples here. And just as I mentioned, a visual field is basically kind of whatever you see right in front of your eye. And again, both eyes get some of each visual field, but that information from the eyes is then sent to the opposite hemisphere. And we'll cover this information about how vision works a little bit more in our next unit, Unit 3, which is sensation and perception. But we kind of just need to have a basic understanding of this for now to understand split brain patients. So as I mentioned, someone who has an intact brain, they have a corpus callosum that's able to send information between both hemispheres. But individuals with a split brain, either intentionally or unintentionally, have something wrong with their corpus callosum, and therefore each hemisphere cannot talk to the other one, but instead the information just remains in each separate hemisphere. So this is kind of where we're going to look at this interesting, a little bit complicated example here. And there are two main people you need to know who study split brain patients. And one is Michael Gazzaniga, and the other is Robert Sperry. So those are the two names that you definitely want to make sure that you know in terms of split brain patients. But basically, how they studied this is they have an individual who is split brain. So again, their two hemispheres don't talk to each other. And what they would do, and actually here it goes through step by step. So let me show you. So what they would do is they have a dot on the screen, and they would tell the split brain patient, look at this dot, just stare at that dot, and that's it. And the point of staring at just that dot is that it creates two separate visual fields then. It creates a left visual field to the left of the dot and a right visual field to the right of the dot. Then what they did is they flashed the word, kind of quickly, they flashed the word heart. And just in the left visual field, you saw the letters H-E with he, and in the right visual field, you saw A-R-T, art. So total the word is heart, but just staring in the middle, it created two separate visual fields. In the left was he, in the right was art. But remember, as we said, visual fields are processed in the opposite hemispheres. So seeing he in the left visual field would then get processed by your right hemisphere, and seeing art in the right visual field will get processed by the left hemisphere. But it even gets a little more interesting than that. So these split brain patients were then asked to tell the researcher what they saw. So when the word heart was flashed, there was a whole word flashed, but patients with split brain ended up saying out loud that they saw the word art. So how does that happen? Why did they end up saying the word art? Couldn't they have maybe said the word he instead? Let's figure out how this happened. So don't forget that things in the right visual field are perceived by the left hemisphere. And something really important to note is that in the left hemisphere, there are our areas, Broca and Wernicke's areas, that control our language processing. So your left hemisphere of your brain is primarily where your language is processed. So that means if you kind of have to think about these things in reverse here. So in the left in the left visual field, they saw the word he, and the right visual field saw the word art. So if something is seen in the right visual field, and that's the word art, it is sent to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere controls language. It controls both understanding and production of language. So that means that the patient is going to say out loud that they saw the word art, because language is controlled in the left side. So whatever the left sees is what's in the right visual field, and that was art. But there's even more than that. It keeps getting more interesting. Since, again, your brain is cross-wired, so not only is vision processed in opposite hemispheres, but your movement of your body is also controlled by the opposite hemisphere. So moving your right arm is controlled by your left hemisphere. Moving your left arm is controlled by your right hemisphere. There's a way more stuff going on in your brain than you probably ever realized, but lots of stuff going on here. So that means that, again, anything you do with your left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. Anything you do with the right hand is controlled by the left visual hemisphere. So if they asked someone, like it says down here, point with your left hand to the word that you saw, and they give them on a piece of paper the word he and the word art, point with your left hand to the word that you saw, they would point to the word he, because the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere sees what is in the left visual field, and what was on the left visual field was the word he. All right, so just to kind of recap there, if you are asked what you will see, you will say whatever is language is controlled in the left hemisphere. So whatever is in your right visual field is what you will say out loud that you saw. If you're asked to point with your left hand to what you saw, you will point to whatever was in your left visual field. So an easy way to remember this is that if you are asked to point with your hand, you're going to point to whatever is on that same side. That kind of helps you speed up that understanding in your mind a little bit. So left hand controlled by the right side of the brain. Right side of the brain sees what's on the left. So that means left hand will point to what's on their left. So let's kind of do some examples here with this. If there's a split brain patient, and by the way, make sure you understand that these scenarios only happen with split brain patients. So the mass majority of people in the population have intact corpus callosums. So this is not something that would happen to us because we simultaneously would see both words at the same time. And that's why in our minds, it would be the word heart. But for people who are split brain, they see both visual fields at the same time, but each half of their brain doesn't know that they're seeing the other half. So those patients are actually really caught off guard when they say like, so what did you see? And they say the word art. They're like, whoa, I didn't know that's what I saw. Or they point to the word he, they're like, I didn't know that's what I saw, because their brain just, the two sides aren't communicating with each other. So let's look at this other example here. If you work with a split brain patient, a researcher flashes a picture of a palm tree in the left visual field and an ice cream cone in the right visual field. So let's predict what would happen then. If the patient is asked to tell them to say what they saw, what would they report? Think about that for a second. And the best way to solve these questions is to instantly figure out what is each hemisphere seeing. So I got us a little graphic representation here, and clearly I'm a fantastic artist. So here's our left hemisphere, here's our right. On the left visual field, you see a palm tree. On the right visual field, you see an ice cream cone. So that means that if the palm tree is in the left visual field, the right hemisphere is seeing the palm tree. If the ice cream is in the right visual field, the left hemisphere is seeing the ice cream. So if the patient is asked to tell what they saw and language is in the left hemisphere, that means they will report that they saw the ice cream. So left hemisphere is language. So whatever is in the right visual field is what they'll say. So they say they saw the ice cream. If they are asked to use their right hand to point to the object that they saw, your right hand is controlled by your left hemisphere. Left hemisphere processes what is seen in the right visual field, so they will point with their right hand to the ice cream. And don't forget that little shortened trick I taught you, that if you have to point with your right hand, you're going to point to whatever is seen on the right visual field. So they point to the ice cream. Last part here, if you're asked to use your left hand to point to the object that's seen, left hand controlled by the right hemisphere processes what is seen in the left visual field. So you would point with your left hand to the palm tree. And again, the shortened version is left hand points to what's in the left visual field, which was the palm tree. So hopefully this is kind of making sense to you. Like I said, it can get complicated, but you just really have to slow down and write down each part of things. And again, a big trick is to automatically figure out what is each hemisphere seeing, not what is each visual field seeing, but instead what is each hemisphere seeing. That can then help you figure out the rest of the problem after that. So let's try another one here. A split brain patient has a picture of a dog flashed to his right hemisphere and a cat to his left hemisphere. He will be able to identify the what? So you really want to think through this one carefully. And I will also throw out there that you definitely want to read it extremely carefully, because there's a little trick in this one. All right, so the correct answer here is A. They will be able to identify the cat using his right hand. So something you need to realize here is that this question says it's flashed to the right hemisphere and the cat is flashed to his left hemisphere, not visual field. So they're not giving you that first initial what they're seeing, but instead which hemisphere it's going to. So if the dog is flashed to the right hemisphere, that's what's being processed in the right hemisphere. That means the dog is actually what's on the left visual field. And the cat is being shown to the left hemisphere. So that means it's actually in the right visual field. So if you need to figure out what they will point to, you know that the left hemisphere saw the cat, which was in the right visual field. So the right hand would point to what was on the right, and that was the cat. So that's letter A. So read super, super carefully with every question, but especially these. It's very important to do that. And you can even see this tip here from about the AP exam. So just make sure you read that carefully as well. All right, so what else are some of the differences between the left and the right hemisphere? Now we're back to talking about the generally typically developed person with their two hemispheres, not someone who's split brain. So intact corpus callosums here. What does each hemisphere do? So generally, the left hemisphere tends to control things like speaking and language, math calculations, taking things literally, and controlling the right side of the body, as we mentioned. The right hemisphere is generally responsible for perceptual tasks, making inferences, modulating speech, meaning not the production and understanding of speech, but instead things like inflections in your speech. So asking a question or making an exclamation, like those kinds of things. The right hemisphere is also visual perception, recognition of emotions, and obviously controls the left side of the body. So really generally, the left side is typically your logical side, logic and language. Your right side is typically more of your artsy side. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like super artistic, but things like even just being able to visually and spatially understand things. The left side takes things more literally. The right side is able to kind of read between the lines and think more abstractly. But really important to note, as I said at the beginning, we only have one brain, but there's two separate hemispheres in the brain, two separate hemispheres that work together in a typically developed person. So humans are not actually left-brained or right-brained, because instead your entire brain is always helping you to do things. It always integrates all the things that you're seeing or taking in from different visual fields and auditory fields and everything. Your entire brain is used at once, but each half is kind of just responsible for some different functions. So whenever you might hear people say, it's something that you hear a lot, like I'm more left brain, I'm more right brain, that's actually a myth. That's not something that is possible. Instead, we use our entire brain all the time. Just the separate hemispheres have different specializations. So which of the following is most likely to be a function of the left hemisphere? Go ahead and take a second to think about it. That would be letter A, speech, because speech is language, language left. Language is the left hemisphere. And again, just feel free to read through this AP exam tip as well. So our last part here to talk about is consciousness. And consciousness is our subjective awareness of ourselves and our environment. So it's the part that you are actually aware of, whereas the unconscious is what you are not aware of. It's below your actual awareness. And throwback to Unit 1, the unconscious is a big focus of who and what perspective? Sigmund Freud and the psychoanalytic perspective. So instead of talking about the unconscious, we're talking about the conscious mind. So cognitive neuroscience is a field that kind of tries to combine the study of brain activity and how we learn, think, remember, and perceive. So it's basically combining the brain and the mind. It's taking those two things together. And they're trying to map out the conscious functions of the cortex. So what are the things that we are actually aware of that our brain is doing? So one thing to understand is this term called dual processing. And that's the principle that we have a two-track mind. So simultaneously, our mind is always processing things at a conscious level, at a level that we are aware of, and at an unconscious level, a level we are not aware of. So sometimes we say that that conscious level is like the high road, where you have to kind of think things through, and the unconscious is the automatic low road, where your brain just does things without you even knowing it. So the high road is more reflective. The low road is more intuitive. The low road just acts. The high road thinks things through a little more. There's also this term called blind sight, which we're not going to get into too much, but Basically, it's kind of this thing where even though you might have some visual disabilities or something, you might still actually be able to unconsciously process visual things. So someone might not be able to fully see everything in front of them, yet they could be asked about seeing a particular thing and they can tell you what they saw, but again, they have no idea how they figured that out. So your mind can do things unconsciously while it's also doing things consciously, and that's dual processing. So the dual processing model refers to which of these following ideas? Go ahead and read through the answer choices there. That would be letter B. Incoming information is processed by both conscious and unconscious tracks. All right, last couple of things here real quick. Some other kinds of processing that we have are parallel processing and sequential processing. So parallel processing, careful because this can sound kind of similar to dual processing, but they're different. So parallel processing is that we can process many different aspects of something at the same time. So for example, you might look at a picture of a bird and you just automatically say like, oh yeah, like that's a bird. But while your brain is processing the label of the animal, it's also processing things like what is the shape of this animal? What is the texture of it? What's the color? What do the lines look like? Your brain is doing all these different processing at the same time. And you're not sitting there specifically thinking, now what's the shape of this? What about the color? Does it have feathers? Your brain just does that automatically. So parallel processing is that there's a bunch of things simultaneously going on when you're trying to process a problem. And parallel processing is usually used with our well-learned information or to solve easy problems. So things you know really well or things that don't require a lot of thought. Sequential processing instead is when you process one piece at a time. And that's usually because we use it to process new information or to solve difficult problems. We can't really just be like, oh, okay, and have all these different things coming at the same time, but instead you need to do one thing after another. So parallel processing is a very quick and kind of more automatic thing. Sequential processing is a lot slower and requires you to kind of methodically think through things. All right, so that is it for module number 13. Go ahead and look over these review slides here so that you can understand those things a little bit more. And I will see you again for module 14 in a quick second. Bye.